The Call of the Wild by Jack London, adapted version, Chapter 5, Other Fires, Other Worlds. The morning after the fight, Spitz was missing, and Buck was covered with wounds. What I say, the truth when I say that Buck is two devils, said Francois. That Spitz fight like hell, said Perrault, as he looked at Buck's wounds. Now we might make good time. No more Spitz, no more trouble for sure. While Perrault packed up the camp, Francois began to harness the dogs. Buck trotted to the lead, where Spitz would normally have been. But Francois brought Solix forward. Buck sprang at Solix in a fury, driving him back. Francois slapped his legs and laughed. Look at that Buck, he said. He kills Spitz, and he thinks he can take his job. Go away. Buck would not move. He growled angrily as Francois dragged him to one side. Again, Francois put Solix in the lead. But as soon as the man turned his back, Buck again drove Solix back off. By now, Francois was angry. Now, by God, I fix you, he cried. Francois picked up a heavy club and moved towards Buck. Buck remembered the man in the red sweater. He moved away from Francois slowly, snarling with rage. His eyes were fixed on the club. Solix was again put in lead. Francois called Buck to his old place in front of Dave, but Buck only moved away. For the better part of an hour, Perrault and Francois chased after Buck. They threw clubs at him and cursed him, but Buck would not join the team. He was in open revolt. He would be the leader. He had earned the honor, and he would not be satisfied with anything less. Francois sat down and scratched his head. Perrault looked at his watch and swore. They were wasting time. They should have been on the trail an hour ago. Francois could not help grinning. He and Perrault knew that they were beaten. Francois went to where Solix stood and called Buck. Buck seemed to laugh, a kind of dog laugh, and he kept his distance. Even after Francois put Solix in his old place on the team, Buck still held back. Throw down the club, Perrault yelled. When Francois had thrown down the club, Buck trotted over to the head of the team. Soon the sled dashed onto the trail. Buck quickly took up the duties of leader. Francois soon learned that Buck was even better than Spitz had been. Buck set about whipping the team into shape. Pike was thrashed for not carrying his load. The first night in camp, Buck punished Joe, something Spitz was never able to do. At Pink Rapids, 2 new Huskies were added to the team. Buck swiftly broke them in. They were now making record time. The trail was in excellent condition, hard and well packed. The temperature stayed at 50 below zero during the whole trip. 30 Mile River was covered in just one day. On the 14th day, the lights of the Skagway were seen. It had been a record run. For 3 days, Perrault and Francois were the talk of the town, but before very long, interest turned to other things, and Francois received new orders. He hugged Buck and wept, and that was the last Buck saw of Francois and Perrault. They passed out of his life forever. A Scotsman took charge of the team. With a dozen other teams, they started back to Dawson. The load was heavy and the work was hard. This was a mail train carrying news of the world to the men seeking gold. Buck did not like this job, but he took pride in his work. One day was very much like the other. In the mornings, fires were built, breakfast was eaten, and the dogs were harnessed. Then camp was broken, and they were underway. At night, camp was made, firewood was cut, and dogs were fed. Buck proved his mastery again in 3 fierce fights with other dogs. At night, Buck loved to lie near the fire. Sometimes he thought of Judge Miller's big house in the sun-kissed snowlands. But more often, he remembered the man in the red sweater. He also remembered the death of Curly and the fight with Spitz. He was not homesick. The sunland was very dim and distant. The memory of his ancestors was far more powerful. Sometimes he would lay by the fire. Buck seemed to see the flames of another fire. The man by that fire was not the cook, but a different man, one with shorter legs, longer arms, and knotty muscles. The man's hair was long and matted. His forehead slanted. His hand hung midway between knee and foot. In his hand he clutched a stick with a heavy stone at the end. He was naked except for a ragged and fire-scorched animal skin on his back. His body was hairy. He did not walk upright, but leaned forward on bent knees. Beyond the fire seemed to see gleaming coals, 2 by 2, always 2 by 2. Buck knew that these were the eyes of great beasts. He could hear them crashing through the undergrowth. He could hear them making noises in the night. These sights and sounds of another world seemed made him growl softly. But when the cook shouted, "Hey, Buck, wake up," the real world came back. It was a hard trip with heavy work. The dogs were in poor shape when they reached Dawson. They should have had a long rest, but in 2 days' time, they were loaded up again with letters for the return trip to Skagway. The dogs were tired and the drivers grumbled. To make things worse, it snowed every day. The soft snow made the pulling even harder. The strength of the dogs disappeared. Since the beginning of winter, they had dragged sleds 1,800 miles. Billy cried and whimpered in his sleep each night. Joe was more upset than ever. No one dared to get near Sol Leks's blind side or other side. Buck, too, was very tired. It was Dave who suffered most of all. Something had gone wrong with him. He became depressed and cranky. When camp was made, he quickly made his nest and did not get on his feet until morning. If the sled stopped suddenly or jerked, he would cry out in pain. One night, the drivers brought Dave out to the fire. They could see nothing wrong, but when they pressed or poked, he cried out. Something was wrong inside. Before long, Dave was falling into his harness often. The Scotsman took him out of the team to let him rest. Dave growled at Sol Leks, was put in the place nearest the sled. When the sled started to move, Dave jumped at Sol Leks, trying to throw him off into the snow. He yelped and cried with pain as he tried to take back his old place. His strength was gone, and he staggered along behind the sled to the next stop. When the driver tried to start the sled again, the dogs swung out easily, and the sled did not move. Dave had bitten through Sol Leks's harness and was standing in front of the sled. His eyes begged to go back to his old place. The driver was puzzled. The men talked of dogs they had known that had died from lack of work. Although the work would have killed them, they decided that since Dave was dying anyway, he would die in the harness. He was put back in the place on the team. Several times he fell down, and once the sled ran over his legs. Thereafter, he limped on one of his hind legs. More than once, Dave cried out in pain, but he held out until camp was reached. The next morning, he was too weak to travel. He tried to call to his driver, then staggered slowly to where the dogs were being harnessed. The last his teammates saw of him, he lay gasping on the snow, and they could hear his mournful howl until they reached the belt of trees. The team stopped, and the Scotsman walked back to the camp. The other stopped talking. A pistol shot rang out. When the Scotsman returned, whips snapped, and the sled began to prowl along the trail. Buck knew, and every dog knew, what had happened behind the belt of trees. The Call of the Wild by Jack London. Chapter 6, Sold for a Song. 30 days after leaving Dawson, the mail arrived at Skagway. The dogs were in a wretched state, worn out and worn down. Pike and Solex limped badly, and Dub suffered from an injured shoulder. All of them were footsore and thin. Their strength had been used up, every last bit of it. There was no spring in their feet as they tottered down the main drive of the town. They were dead tired. The drivers had looked forward to a long stopover. But so many men had rushed north looking for gold, and so many relatives had been left behind. The mail was piled high, and orders were waiting. Fresh dogs were to take the place of the worthless ones. In a few days, Buck and his teammates were sold, harnesses and all. The Scotsman and the other men passed out of Buck's life, just like Perrault and Francois had. The new owners were from the States and called each other Hal and Charles. Charles was a weak-looking man with weak eyes and a turned-up mustache. Hal was just 19 or 20 and carried a big revolver and a hunting knife on his belt. Both men looked very much out of place. When Buck and his teammates were driven to the new owner's camp, Buck saw a sloppy mess. The tents was not stretched, the dishes were not washed, and everything was in disorder. Buck also saw a woman the men called Mercedes. She was Charles's wife and Hal's sister. Buck watched as they started to load the sled. They rolled the tent into bundles 3 times as large as it should have been. They packed unwashed tin dishes. Throughout all of this, Mercedes fluttered about giving advice. When a clothes sack was loaded on the front, she wanted to put it on the back. When the men covered it over, she found more things she wanted to pack in the very sack. 3 men from a nearby tent looked on, grinning and winking at one another. "I wouldn't tote that tent along if I was you," said one. "What?" Mercedes cries. "However in the world could I manage without a tent?" "It's springtime. You won't get any more cold weather," the man replied. "Think it'll ride?" asked another. "Seems a bit too top-heavy." At that, Hall swung his whip and shouted, "Mush! Mush on there!" The dogs strained hard but could not move the sled. As Hal raised his wish to lash them again, Mercedes cried, "Oh, Hal, you mustn't." Then she grabbed the whip from his hand. "The poor dears, you must promise not to be mean to them, or I won't go on a step." "Precious little thing, you know about dogs," her brother said. "They're lazy. You've got to whip them." "They're weak as water, if you want to know," one of the men said. "They need a rest." "Rest be blanked," Hal said. He took the whip and cracked it again and again over the dogs. They were still unable to move the sled. One of the men could keep quiet no longer. "It's not that I care a whoop what becomes of you, but I care about the dogs. Your runners are froze fast. Throw your weight against it and left and break it out." Hal followed this advice, and the overloaded sleigh moved ahead. But as they were going down a steep slope towards the main street, the sled tipped over. The dogs broke into a run, pulling the sled on its side. The contents scattered wildly along the main street of Skagway. Kind-hearted citizens caught the dogs and picked up the belongings. They also gave the new driver some advice. "Half the load, twice the dogs, if they expect to reach Dawson," was what they said. Men laughed as canned goods and thick blankets were unloaded. "Throw away the tent and all those dishes. Who's going to wash them?" one of the men said. Charles and Hal went out that evening and bought 6 more dogs. This brought the team to 14. These new dogs did not seem to know anything, but could teach them what not to do and not what to do. Buck could teach them what not to do, but not what to do. Okay. They did not take kindly to the harness and the trail. With these newcomers and the worn-out old team, things did not look bright. The 2 men, however, were quite proud and cheerful. Their team was larger than any they had seen. But there was a reason why they had never seen 14 dogs on a team. One sled could not carry enough food for 14 dogs. But Charles and Hal did not know this. The next morning, Buck led the long team up the streets. There was no snap to their steps. They were dead weary, and they had no faith in their masters. As the days went by, it became clear that their masters did not know how to do anything. It took them half the night to pitch the tent. The sled was packed so poorly that they had to stop often to fix the load. On some days, they did not make 10 miles. On other days, they were unable to even get started. And at no time did they cover the distance they had used in figuring the amount of dog food they needed. To make matters worse, they overfed the dogs. Mercedes, with tears in her eyes, begged Hal to feed them even more. But it was not food that Buck and the Huskies needed. It was rest. Hal awoke one day and realized that the dog food was half gone, and they had gone only a quarter of the way to Dawson. Hal cut back on the food and tried to increase the day's travel. The first to go was Dub. His shoulder had gone from bad to worse. Finally, Hal shot him with his big revolver. Next, the new dogs, not used to having so little food, began to die. Mercedes no longer wept over the dogs. She wept for herself. The two men and the woman argued all the time. They lacked the patience of those who worked and suffered in the Arctic. They argued over who did more work, who should chop a few sticks for the fire, so the fire remained unbuilt, the camp half-pitched, and the dogs unfed. Mercedes was particularly quarrelsome. It was her habit to be helpless. She was sore and tired and insisted on riding on the sleigh. This extra 120 pounds added the last straw to the load. She rode for days until the weak and starving dogs fell in their harnesses. The sled stood still. Charles and Hal begged her to get off and walk. Mercedes just cried and called them brutes. Once the men picked Mercedes up and took her from the sled by force. They never did it again. She let her legs go limp like a spoiled child and sat on the trail. After traveling for 3 miles, they went back for her and put her on the sled again. In their misery, the men ignored the animals. The food was gone now. Buck staggered along at the head of the team as if in a nightmare. He fell often and stayed down until a whipping brought him up again. His limp hair was matted with blood. Each rib and every bone was outlined on his skin. But Buck's heart was unbreakable. The man in the red sweater had proven that. Like Buck, the other 6 dogs were walking skeletons. There came a day when Billy fell and couldn't get back up. Hal took an axe and knocked Billy on the head. Buck and the other dogs knew that the same fate awaited them. The next day, another teammate died. Only 5 dogs remained. All were crippled and limping. The spring weather was beautiful, but neither dog nor human were aware of it. Dawn came at 3 a.m, and twilight lasted until 9 p.m. Wedges of wild fowl fled overhead. From every hill came the trickle of water. Everything was thawing. Cracks formed in the ice, and thin pieces of ice fell into the river. Throughout the Arctic spring, humans and dogs staggered into John Thornton's camp at White River. Buck's group arrived late in the season. Hal did all the talking. John Thornton sat quietly, whittling an axe handle. He gave short answers to their questions and offered little advice because he knew it would not be followed. Thornton warned them to take no more chances on the melting ice. Hal sneered. "They told us we couldn't make White River, but here we are. Only fools with a fool's luck could have made it," Thornton replied. "I'll tell you straight, I wouldn't risk that ice for all of the gold in Alaska." "That's because you're not a fool, I suppose," Hal said. "All the same, we're going to Dawson." Then, uncoiling his whip, he yelled, "Get up there, Buck! Get up! Mush on!" The team did not move. The whip flashed again and again. Sol-leks was the first to crawl to his feet. The others followed, but Buck did not. He lay quietly where he had fallen. The whip fell on him again and again. Hal flew into a rage and picked up his club. Blow after blow rained down on Buck. Still he would not move. He had suffered so much that the blows no longer hurt much. The spark of life flickered in him, and he went down. He was numb to the pain. He could hear the club hitting him, but he felt nothing. Without warning, John Thornton let out a cry. He sprang on Hal and hurled him backwards. Mercedes screamed, but Charles was too stiff to move. "If you strike that dog again, I'll kill you," he said in a choking voice. Hal drew up his long hunting knife. Thornton rapped Hal's hand with the axe handle, and the knife fell to the ground. He rapped him again, and when he tried to pick it up, then Thornton picked up the knife, and the 2 quick strokes cut Buck's harness. Hal had no fight in him. A few minutes later, the 2 men, 1 woman, and 4 dogs started across the thawing river. As Buck watched them leave, Thornton knelt beside him. His rough but kind hands felt for broken bones. Nothing was broken, just bruised and starvation. Dog and man watched the sled crawl across the ice. Suddenly, they saw its back end drop. Mercedes' scream came to their ears. A large piece of ice gave way. The dogs and humans disappeared. Thornton and Buck looked at each other. "You poor devil," John said, and Buck loosed his hand affectionately.